The Apollo Theater in Harlem stood under gray November skies on the afternoon of November 15, 1968, its marquee announcing Amateur Night, a tradition that had launched careers and crushed dreams in equal measure for 3 decades. Inside, the theater was only half full for the matinee performance. Mostly older folks seeking shelter from the cold, and young hustlers waiting for evening shows when the real crowds would arrive. The atmosphere was casual, almost dismissive, people talking among themselves, eating snacks, treating the amateur performances as background noise rather than serious entertainment. On stage, acts came and went with varying degrees of competence, most of them forgettable, a few showing sparks of talent that might develop into something with years of work and luck. The audience applauded politely when performances were decent, stayed silent when they were not, and occasionally heckled when someone was particularly bad or particularly arrogant. The host, a man named James who had been introducing acts at the Apollo since before most of the audience was born, went through his routine with practiced efficiency, reading names off cards, making small jokes, keeping the show moving because he knew that most people were really just killing time until the evening lineup started. Backstage, in a cramped dressing room that smelled of old makeup and nervous sweat, 10-year-old Michael Jackson sat on a folding chair that was too tall for him, his feet not quite reaching the floor. His brothers surrounded him, the Jackson 5 preparing for what they hoped would be their breakthrough performance, the moment that would get them noticed by someone important, someone who could change their lives. Michael's father, Joe Jackson, stood by the door reviewing a set list he had written and rewritten dozens of times, trying to find the perfect combination of songs that would showcase his son's talents without running over the strict time limit Amateur Night imposed. Joe was a hard man, his face set in permanent lines of determination and disappointment, someone who had worked in steel mills and knew that talent alone was never enough, that success required discipline and ruthlessness and the willingness to push past comfort into the territory where excellence lived. He looked at his sons, these 5 boys who ranged in age from 10 to 17, and he saw not just his children but his chance to escape Gary, Indiana, to prove that he was more than a factory worker, to build something that would outlast him. Michael, the youngest of the performing brothers, sat quietly while his older siblings joked and stretched and ran through harmonies. He was small for his age, his voice still high and pure, his movements already showing the grace that would later define him but that now just made him look delicate, almost fragile compared to his bigger, louder brothers. Joe had been reluctant to put Michael in the lead position, worried that audiences would not take a 10-year-old seriously, that his youth would be seen as a gimmick rather than genuine talent. But the older boys had insisted, had argued that Michael's voice was the best they had, that when he sang people stopped what they were doing and listened, that his age would be an advantage once people heard him rather than a liability. The stage manager knocked on the door and called out that they had 5 minutes. The Jackson brothers stood up, forming a circle like they always did before performances, and they put their hands together in the center while Joe reminded them of everything they had practiced, every step and spin and vocal harmony that had to be perfect if they wanted anyone to pay attention. Michael listened to his father's instructions with the serious concentration of someone much older, nodding at appropriate moments, asking questions when something was unclear, treating this amateur matinee performance like it was Madison Square Garden because he did not know how to treat it any other way. When the prayer was finished and the hands separated, the brothers filed toward the stage entrance, and Michael took his position at the front of the line, straightening the vest his mother had altered to fit his small frame, checking his shoes to make sure they were tied tight enough for the dancing he knew was coming. He could hear James on stage introducing them, his voice carrying that practiced enthusiasm that did not quite mask his skepticism about yet another group of kids who thought they could sing, who thought they were special, who would probably be mediocre like most of the acts he introduced week after week. The Jackson 5 walked onto the stage, and the first thing the audience noticed was how young they were, particularly Michael, who looked even smaller under the stage lights, his slim frame dwarfed by his brothers and by the massive space of the Apollo. Someone in the balcony laughed, a sound that carried clearly in the half-empty theater, and that laugh triggered others, a ripple of amusement at the sight of these children, particularly this tiny one standing front and center, who clearly thought he belonged on a professional stage. James finished his introduction with a joke about needing booster seats, and the audience laughed again, louder this time, convinced that what they were about to witness would be cute at best, embarrassing at worst, but certainly not serious entertainment worthy of their full attention. The house band, session musicians who had played for legends, looked at each other with expressions that suggested they were already bored, already thinking about the next act, already dismissing these kids as another forgettable moment in a long career of forgettable moments. Michael stood at the microphone, which had been lowered to accommodate his height, and he looked out at the audience with dark eyes that showed no fear, no doubt, just intense focus on what he was about to do. The music started, a driving rhythm that the band played with professional competence but without enthusiasm, going through the motions because that was their job but not investing any real energy because they did not expect these kids to be worth the effort. The older Jackson brothers began their choreography, moves they had practiced 10,000 times in their living room in Gary, and they were good, genuinely good, hitting their marks with precision that surprised the musicians and made a few people in the audience sit up slightly straighter. But it was background, preparation, the setup for what came next. Then Michael opened his mouth and began to sing, and the laughter stopped immediately, cut off mid-breath as if someone had flipped a switch. His voice, impossibly mature for a 10-year-old, filled the Apollo Theater with a power and control that should not have been possible from someone his size, his age, his apparent youth. He was not trying to sound older, not affecting some deep tone that would have been comical. He was singing in his natural voice, high and clear, but with an emotional depth and technical precision that made the distinction between child and adult performer completely irrelevant. The song told a story about love and loss, and Michael inhabited every word, making people believe that he understood heartbreak, that he had lived through the pain the lyrics described, that he was not just performing but testifying. The audience fell silent, not the polite silence of people paying attention but the stunned silence of people who could not believe what they were hearing. In the third row, a woman who had been eating popcorn stopped with her hand halfway to her mouth, the kernels forgotten as she stared at this child on stage who was delivering a vocal performance that would have been impressive from someone 3 times his age. In the balcony, the man who had laughed first now leaned forward, his elbows on the railing, his face showing the transformation from mockery to amazement. The house band, those jaded session musicians who thought they had heard everything, began to play differently, adding energy and nuance to their performance, responding to what Michael was giving them, feeding off his intensity the way professionals do when they recognize they are in the presence of something special. Michael's brothers continued their choreography around him, but even they seemed to fade into the background because everyone's attention was locked on this 10-year-old who was redefining what they thought possible. His voice climbed to high notes that rang through the theater like bells, then descended into lower registers with a smoothness that demonstrated complete control of his instrument. He was not just singing. He was performing in the truest sense, using his voice as a tool to create emotion, to tell a story, to connect with every person in that audience on a level that transcended age or experience or any other barrier. 2 minutes into the song, Michael executed a spin that transitioned into a slide, a move that looked effortless but required perfect timing and body control, and the silence broke as the audience erupted in spontaneous applause in the middle of the performance, something that rarely happened, something that demonstrated they could not contain their reaction until the end. But Michael did not acknowledge the applause. He stayed in character, stayed focused on the song, letting the interruption wash over him while he continued to deliver every note, every word, every emotional beat with unwavering commitment. His brothers hit their mark for a harmony section, their voices blending with Michael's in a way that showed hours of practice, and the resulting sound was so perfectly balanced, so professionally executed, that James, standing in the wings, actually said out loud to no one in particular, "These kids are going to be stars." The stage manager next to him, a woman who had worked at the Apollo for 15 years and prided herself on not being impressed by anyone, nodded in agreement, her arms covered in goosebumps despite the warmth of the backstage area. She had seen this happen maybe 3 times in her entire career, this moment when an unknown performer transformed from a name on a card into someone undeniable, someone whose talent was so obvious it felt like a physical force in the room. The song built toward its climax, and Michael's voice built with it, gaining power and intensity while somehow maintaining perfect pitch and control. He hit the final high note and held it, his small body absolutely still except for his chest rising and falling with the breath that sustained the sound, and that note seemed to go on forever, longer than should have been possible from someone with such small lung capacity. The band played the final bars. Michael released the note at exactly the right moment, and he struck a pose that his brothers mirrored behind him, all 5 of them frozen like a photograph as the last chord faded to silence. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, the Apollo Theater was completely quiet. Not a cough, not a whisper, not the rustle of a program. Just silence as the audience processed what they had witnessed, tried to reconcile the tiny child they had laughed at minutes earlier with the powerhouse performer who had just delivered something extraordinary. Then the applause began, and it was not polite or measured. It was explosive, people jumping to their feet instantly, screaming and clapping and whistling, the half-full theater somehow sounding like it contained thousands rather than hundreds of people because of the intensity of their reaction. If this story moves you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These untold moments from music history deserve to be remembered and shared with the world. The standing ovation continued as the Jackson 5 took their bows. Michael in the center, his brothers on either side, all of them smiling, but Michael's smile showing something different than his brother's pride. His smile showed relief, showed the release of pressure that had been building for months as they practiced and prepared and bet everything on this moment. James ran back onto the stage, his prepared remarks completely forgotten, and he grabbed Michael by the shoulders, turning him to face the audience, shouting into his microphone that they had just witnessed history, that they needed to remember this moment, remember these names, because the Jackson 5 was going to be huge. The audience cheered louder, agreeing with him, knowing on some instinctual level that what he said was true, that they had been present for something significant. In the VIP box that most people had not noticed was occupied, Berry Gordy sat forward in his seat, his expression intense as he watched this 10-year-old child command a stage with the confidence of a veteran performer. Berry had come to the Apollo that afternoon on a whim, filling time between meetings, not expecting to see anything that would interest him. Now he was already mentally calculating, already planning how to sign these kids to Motown, already hearing hit records in his head with Michael's voice at the center. The ovation continued for 90 seconds, then 2 minutes, people refusing to stop clapping, refusing to let the moment end because they understood they might never experience anything quite like it again. The musicians in the band were clapping too, standing at their positions and applauding these kids who had made them play better, made them care about a matinee amateur performance in a way they had not cared in years. Finally, reluctantly, the audience began to settle, sitting back down, wiping tears from their eyes, turning to the people next to them to confirm that what they had just witnessed was real, was as extraordinary as it had seemed. Michael and his brothers walked off stage, and as soon as they were in the wings, out of sight of the audience, Michael's legs gave out. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the performance drained away all at once, and he sat down on the floor, his back against the wall, shaking. His brothers crowded around him, concerned, but Michael was not sick or hurt. He was just overwhelmed, processing the magnitude of what had just happened, the transformation of the audience from laughter to silence to ovation in the space of 3 minutes. Joe Jackson found his sons backstage, and for once his hard face showed emotion, showed pride that he usually kept buried under layers of discipline and criticism. He knelt down next to Michael, and in a voice that the other brothers had rarely heard from their father, he said, "You did it. You showed them what I knew you could do." Michael nodded, unable to speak, and Joe stood up and gathered all his sons together, telling them that everything was about to change, that word of this performance would spread, that opportunities would come, that their lives in Gary were essentially over even though they would not physically leave for months yet. He was right. Before the evening show even started, before most of the Apollo's regular crowd arrived, the story of the 10-year-old who had silenced the matinee audience was spreading through Harlem, person to person, each retelling adding details but not needing to exaggerate because the truth was extraordinary enough. People who had not been there kicked themselves for missing it, promised they would catch the evening show, told their friends who told their friends until the line outside the Apollo for the evening performance stretched around the block with people hoping to see if the Jackson 5 was really as good as everyone was saying. Berry Gordy did not wait for the evening show. He went backstage during the intermission after the Jackson 5's performance and introduced himself to Joe Jackson, a meeting that both men would later describe as destiny, as the moment when everything aligned. Berry was direct, telling Joe that he wanted to sign the Jackson 5 to Motown, that he had rarely been so certain about an act, that Michael in particular had something he had only seen a few times in his entire career. Joe, who had dreamed of this moment, who had pushed his sons toward it with a relentlessness that sometimes bordered on cruelty, played it cool, told Barry he would need to think about it, discuss it with his family, consider all their options. But both men knew the decision was already made, that this handshake in a backstage hallway at the Apollo was the beginning of something that would reshape popular music. Barry gave Joe his card, a simple gesture, but Joe held onto that card like it was made of gold, tucking it carefully into his wallet where it would remain for years, even after the Jackson 5 became the biggest act on Motown, even after Michael became the biggest solo artist in the world. That card represented the moment when everything changed, when dreams stopped being abstract wishes and became concrete plans with timelines and contracts and recording sessions. The evening performance was even more powerful than the matinee. The Jackson 5 feeding off the energy of a packed house that had come specifically to see them, that had heard the stories and wanted to witness the phenomenon for themselves. Michael delivered again, his voice somehow even stronger, his performance even more confident now that he knew he could do it, now that the fear of failure had been replaced by the certainty of his own ability. The audience lost their minds, the ovation lasting longer than the performance itself, people throwing flowers onto the stage, reaching out trying to touch these boys who had become instant celebrities in the span of a single afternoon. After the show, Michael and his brothers could barely make it to their dressing room because of the crowd of well-wishers, industry professionals, and fans who wanted to meet them, to congratulate them, to be close to what they sensed was the beginning of something historic. James, the host, told everyone who would listen that in his 30 years at the Apollo, he had maybe seen 5 acts that he knew instantly would become legends, and the Jackson 5 was now on that list, was maybe number 1 on that list because of how complete their talent was, how ready they seemed despite their youth. The Jackson family returned to Gary, Indiana, but everything was different now. Word had reached their hometown, carried by relatives who had been at the Apollo, by neighbors who had heard the story, by local news that picked up on the Motown connection. Michael went back to school, but teachers looked at him differently, classmates treated him like a celebrity, and the normalcy he had known was already slipping away, replaced by a growing awareness that his life was moving in a direction that would separate him from the ordinary experiences of childhood. He practiced more than ever, pushing himself to be better, to justify the faith that Berry Gordy and the Apollo audience had placed in him, to prove that the matinee performance was not a fluke but a preview of what he could consistently deliver. His brothers practiced with him, the 5 of them running through choreography in their basement, singing harmonies until their voices were hoarse, treating their rehearsals with the seriousness of professionals because they understood that opportunity had knocked and they could not afford to be unprepared when it opened the door fully. The Motown contract came through in early 1969, and the Jackson 5 moved to California, leaving behind Gary and everything familiar to pursue the dream that had seemed impossible just months earlier. Their first single was released in October 1969, and it shot to number 1, followed by their second single doing the same, then their third, an unprecedented streak that made them the biggest new act in music and confirmed everything that Berry Gordy had sensed when he watched 10-year-old Michael perform at the Apollo. Michael, still just 11 years old, found himself on television, in magazines, recognized everywhere he went, his voice playing on radios across the country and around the world. The transition from normal kid to superstar happened so fast it was disorienting, and there were moments when Michael felt overwhelmed, when the pressure of being the lead singer, the focal point, the one everyone watched seemed too heavy for someone his age to carry. During those moments, he would remember the Apollo, remember the laughter that had greeted him when he first walked on stage, remember the silence that had fallen when he opened his mouth, remember the ovation that had felt like love, like acceptance, like proof that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories about the legends who shaped music history. Your support helps us continue sharing these incredible moments that deserve to be remembered. Years later, when Michael Jackson was the biggest star on the planet, when he had redefined pop music and broken every record imaginable, interviewers would ask him about his earliest memory of feeling like a real performer, of knowing that music was not just something he did but who he was. He would always mention the Apollo, that November matinee in 1968, the half-full theater that became completely silent when he began to sing. He would describe the laughter, not with bitterness but with understanding that it made the subsequent silence even more meaningful, that the journey from mockery to respect in the span of 2 minutes taught him something essential about performance, about the power of undeniable talent to change minds and hearts. He kept a photograph from that day, a grainy black and white image taken by someone in the audience, showing him at the microphone, his brothers behind him, his small body somehow dominating the frame through sheer presence despite his size. That photograph sat on his desk wherever he worked, in recording studios and in his home office, a reminder of where he had come from, of the moment when the world first really saw him, really understood what he was capable of. The man who had laughed first, the one in the balcony whose amusement had triggered others, eventually came forward years later when Michael was famous, writing a letter to apologize for his dismissiveness. Michael responded personally, thanking him for the letter but explaining that the apology was unnecessary, that the laughter had actually been a gift because it had motivated him to prove himself, to exceed expectations, to transform doubt into belief through the undeniable evidence of his performance. "You helped me that day," Michael wrote in his response. "You showed me that first impressions mean nothing, that people will judge based on appearance or age or their own preconceptions, but that performance can change all of that instantly if you commit fully to what you're doing. I've carried that lesson through my entire career, and it's served me well." The letter was published with the man's permission after Michael's death, and it became a popular quote in discussions about overcoming criticism, about letting work speak louder than words, about the power of excellence to silence skeptics. The Apollo Theater itself enshrined that November 1968 performance in its history, creating a permanent exhibit about the Jackson 5's amateur night appearance, the moment that had launched one of the most successful acts in Motown history. The exhibit included photographs, the original introduction card that James had read from, testimonials from audience members who had been present, and a video compilation of the laughter turning to silence, turning to ovation that demonstrated the dramatic transformation that had occurred in real time. School groups touring the Apollo would stop at this exhibit, and guides would tell the story of the 10-year-old who was underestimated and who responded not with anger or defensiveness but with a performance so undeniable it made mockery impossible. The lesson was clear. Talent speaks for itself, excellence transcends preconceptions, and the willingness to step onto a stage where people are laughing at you requires a courage that many people never develop even as adults. Michael had that courage at 10 years old, and it defined everything that came after. The session musicians who had played for the Jackson 5 that day, those jaded professionals who had started the performance with zero enthusiasm, later recorded their own testimonials about the experience. The drummer, a man who had played for everyone from Ella Fitzgerald to James Brown, said that Michael's performance had reminded him why he became a musician in the first place, had reconnected him with the joy and possibility that drew him to music before it became just a job. The bass player said he could feel the shift in the room when Michael started singing, could feel the energy change from dismissive to electric, and that feeling had given him goosebumps, had made him play better than he had played in months. These testimonials were sincere, unprompted, given years later when Michael was already famous and the musicians had nothing to gain from praising him. They praised him because the experience had genuinely affected them, had reminded them that sometimes, rarely but sometimes, you witnessed something that transcended normal performance and became almost spiritual in its impact. Michael's mother, Katherine Jackson, kept a scrapbook from those early years, and the pages dedicated to that Apollo performance were worn from repeated viewing. She had pasted in newspaper clippings, photographs, the Motown contract, letters from people who had been in the audience and wanted to share how the performance had moved them. But the most treasured item in those pages was a handwritten note from Michael himself, written the night after the performance when they were back in their hotel room. The note said simply, "Today I learned that if you're good enough, it doesn't matter what people think before you start. What matters is what they think when you finish." Katherine had saved that note, recognizing even then that her 10-year-old son had grasped something that many performers never understood, that doubt and skepticism were not obstacles to overcome through argument or explanation but through excellence in execution. Michael lived by that principle for his entire career, letting his performances answer questions, silence critics, and convert skeptics far more effectively than any press release or interview ever could. The legacy of that Apollo performance extended beyond Michael's personal history into the broader cultural understanding of what was possible for young performers. Before the Jackson 5, child performers were often seen as novelties, cute but not serious, talented perhaps but not worthy of the same respect afforded to adult artists. Michael's performance, and the countless performances that followed over the next 5 decades, shattered that perception completely. He proved that age was irrelevant if the talent was genuine, that young performers could deliver emotional depth and technical excellence that rivaled or exceeded their adult counterparts, that the industry's tendency to dismiss children was based on prejudice rather than reality. This shift in perception opened doors for generations of young performers who came after, artists who could point to Michael as proof that youth was not a liability but potentially an asset, that audiences would embrace young talent if it was presented with seriousness and respect rather than as a gimmick or curiosity. In the final analysis, that November day at the Apollo was significant not just because it launched the Jackson 5's career or because it was Michael's first major breakthrough performance. It was significant because it captured in perfect miniature the dynamic that would define Michael's entire relationship with the world. Initial skepticism based on appearance or age or preconceptions, followed by stunned recognition when the performance began, followed by complete acceptance and even adoration once the full scope of his talent became undeniable. This pattern repeated throughout his life, with critics doubting his ability to transition from child star to adult performer, doubting his ability to surpass the success of previous albums, doubting his creative decisions and artistic choices, only to be proven wrong again and again when the work was released and the excellence spoke for itself. That Apollo audience who laughed and then fell silent were the first of many groups who learned that underestimating Michael Jackson was a mistake, that what looked impossible from the outside was routine for someone operating at his level of talent and dedication. The final image, the one that encapsulated the entire story and that remained vivid for everyone who witnessed it, was not of the ovation or the tears or even the performance itself. It was of the silence, that perfect, complete silence that fell over the Apollo Theater when 10-year-old Michael Jackson opened his mouth and began to sing. That silence represented the moment when assumptions died, when laughter became irrelevant, when nothing existed except the voice of this child filling a space that suddenly felt both massive and intimate. People who had been there would describe that silence to their children and grandchildren, would try to explain what it felt like to have every sound cease, every distraction disappear, every thought quiet except the recognition that they were hearing something extraordinary. That silence was the sound of minds changing, of hearts opening, of people realizing that they had been wrong in their initial judgment and being grateful for the opportunity to be corrected through the undeniable evidence of genius. Michael created that silence at 10 years old on a cold November afternoon in Harlem, and in many ways he spent the rest of his life recreating it, making the world stop and listen, proving again and again that excellence transcends every barrier, every prejudice, every doubt, if you have the courage to step onto the stage and deliver.